Right, well, John Wright, the Apostle of Berkshire. The gentleman here on my left is really responsible for setting this in motion, because he said to me, would I think of a Christian who was greatly used by God in the past, but has largely been forgotten? And give a talk about him. And I said, well, yes, I will do that. And it went round in my mind, and I fixed upon this man, John Wright, partly because I find his life inspiring, I hope you will, but partly because he worked in Wrexham and this area, and partly because he also, as you can see, had a surprisingly blessed ministry in Berkshire as well as other places. Now, he was born on the 4th of April, 1790, in Turnditch, which is in Derbyshire. I tried on the internet to get a picture of Turnditch to show you, but there weren't any suitable ones at all, so I just put a map with a ring. That's the black ring in the middle, and you can see it's not very far from the red ring, which is around Mow Cop. And Mow Cop is the place where Primitive Methodism may be said to have begun in 1807 and the following years. So he wasn't terribly far from the epicentre right from the time of his birth. And he had troubles early in his life. I've written them up there for you. His mother died when he was very young, so he didn't really know the love of a mother. He did not like going to school. He didn't like learning and being taught. He did not get on with his new stepmother when his father remarried. In fact, the relationship was so bad that he was sent away, and he had to go and live with a married sister. When he got there, his behaviour was so bad that he had to leave there as well, or at least he did leave there. The relationship really broke down, and then he was sent away, and he lived in a number of places by the age of 20. But at Christmas 1811, he came back to visit his sister, and that is where he began to come under the influence of the Methodists. So 1811, back for Christmas. And in that winter he was converted to faith in Jesus Christ. He tells the story at some length, but I can't give it all to you tonight, but there are places where you can find it out if you want to learn more about him. But this is what he wrote about his conversion. He says, I knelt down in a field of my father's, though it was very cold and much snow was on the ground. I there wrestled and prayed until I thought I heard a voice speaking, Thy sins, which are many, are all forgiven thee. Such love, joy, and glory filled my soul that I knew not how better to express my gratitude to God than by taking my hat up from the ground and throwing it in the air. I shouted, Glory to God, He has pardoned all my sins. So this badly behaved lad who couldn't get on with his family was brought to Christ, and a new life began. So, looking a little bit more into the family and spiritual matters, he married a lady called Martha Riley, and his stepmother died. His father grew older, as we all do, and became infirm, so John and Martha moved back to live with his father. And his father, of course, was involved in the farming life of the area. So John Wright said, while he was doing this sort of work and that sort of family background, I spent much time in prayer. I would retire into the wood after my day's work was done and pour out my soul to God. A very good way, if you want to move into God's service, is to make sure you start off as a person of prayer. Well, he began to feel called to preach. And here's another lesson, I think. He began to do personal evangelism. Now, that's just talking to one or two people. He wanted to preach to many people. as the hymn says, oh, for a trumpet voice on all the world to call. But he started off talking to the ones. Another good principle, if you want to do something big for God, don't sort of dream about it like pipe dreams and wait till the big thing falls into your lap, but start doing the small things that you can do. And it might develop under God. So he did personal evangelism and, very important, attended prayer meetings. So there was a camp meeting. I don't know if you know what camp meetings are. The word camp comes from America, where they really used to set up a camp and have meetings for several days with their wagons in a circle. It was really just a one-day thing in Britain, and sometimes the Primitive Methodists were called Camp Meeting Methodists. Well, he spoke at one of these on the 9th of June 1816 at Merchiston, and he said, I rose up and began to preach with all my might, nor have I forgotten the effects of the glory of this day. Okay, that was fairly spontaneous and unplanned. When he was actually appointed to be a local preacher in the circuit, got up to preach, and it wouldn't come. Found he couldn't preach. And the church said, we don't want this chap coming to preach to us again. But they got on well with him in future visits. In fact, that happened to him a number of times as the years went on. And these great people, we say great, it's only God that makes them great. But these great people, they're not such giants that they haven't got failings and shortcomings. So he doubted his call, and he was tempted to give up altogether. He didn't, praise God for that. Anyway, he decided to emigrate together with his wife. They decided to emigrate, I should say, to America. He was told, you'll have to leave the farm you're working on if you will not leave the Primitive Methodists. A lot of farmers turfed people out of their homes, left them on the street, because they were tied cottages, and if they wouldn't leave the Primitive Methodists, they said, well, we don't want any Methodists in our tied cottages, you'll just have to leave and be unemployed. But he wouldn't leave, the Methodists. He had a wealthy brother who said, I will help you financially if you leave the Primitive Methodists. But he wouldn't do that. And on the 10th of May 1820, the two of them set sail, that's John and his wife, for America, in order to start a life of farming over there. Very sadly, that was May, by August, his wife Martha fell ill. In September, she died, September the 4th. And it seems as if God spoke to her quite plainly as death was approaching. And she said to John, I can't remember the exact words, if you've recorded them in his diary, but basically it boils down to this. John, I am feeling that God has a great work for you to do back in England. You need to give up your ambitions for farming in America and a new life for the family, and you need to go back to England and serve God there. Bit of a struggle, I think, when you've emigrated to the United States, as it's now called, in order to begin a new life. But he felt it was from the Lord, and he returned to England in November, minus, of course, his wife died, and he said, I felt very desolate. And the Lord said that we do have to drink the cup that he drank and be baptized with the baptism that he was baptized with. And the Lord's servants go through desolate times and go through sorrow and doubt and temptation. Well, he worked for his brother-in-law as a farm servant. He was arrested for preaching, but they never got him as far as wherever they used to take people in those days, because his friends somehow came and rescued him from the constable. But he made his way to Bemersley, which is near to Mow Cop, and that's where the Primitive Methodist leaders were living. And he discussed with them what he ought to do, how he should work out this sense of calling that God had given him. And they said to him, the best thing is for you to go into Cheshire, because then you will be able to avoid being arrested if you go back to Ashbourne and to Derbyshire, you see. So he came to Cheshire. Not entirely unlike the people in the Acts of the Apostles who left one place they were persecuted and took the gospel with them. So he came to Cheshire. And he walked. Now, these Prims, they used to walk nearly everywhere. They didn't have horses like John Wesley and his preachers in the previous century, but it was largely done on foot. So he was appointed officially as a travelling preacher, and he went to the Burland branch of the Tunstall Circuit. Now, I don't know if those of you who aren't Methodists will know what a circuit is, but it's a group of churches which are linked together in fellowship under the pastoral charge of the same minister or ministers with the same local preachers. And in the old days, they used to have a branch quite often, which wasn't big enough to be a circuit, but it was quite, it was big enough to be a centre with its own satellites. And they would be called a branch, sometimes perhaps a mission, and he went to the Burland branch. Now, if you ever go to Nantwich, you go through Burland. There's the Primitive Methodist Chapel. You can still see the name over the door and the date. It's a house now, regrettably. That's where he was stationed in Burland. Not that chapel, because that one was opened later than I think it was opened in 1850. Could have been 1850, I'm not exactly sure, but it was later than John Wright's going there. And he said, I felt myself inadequate, but it stimulated me to prayer for increased faith. That's worth repeating. I felt myself inadequate, but it stimulated me to prayer for increased faith. Now, the Burland branch was evangelising in Chester. And there was violent persecution quite often against the Primitive Methodists. And when he came to Chester, he was troubled by the mob, and others were. Persecution raged so strongly that at times no services could be held. When a young brother was planned, the mob drove him and his hearers out and took possession of the place. Now, praise God, we don't have that happening today, but you try and imagine a mob, a raging and angry mob coming in here and saying, we don't want any Christians here, and taking over the place and driving us out. That was what was happening in those days. And that's the road in Chester where the Prims were renting a place. It's called King Street. You may have walked down it many times, for all I know. Now, £17 doesn't sound much, but they were largely poor. They tended to be the lower stratum of society, not all of them, but a lot of them. And the first thing Ryde was burdened with, one of the first things, was this big debt on the preaching room, which they were renting there in King Street. That burdened not just with the mob, persecution, the loss of his wife, now they've got a financial problem as well, which they managed to solve. They managed to raise the money. And from Chester, they worked in Wrexham. Not only in Wrexham, they went to Ashtammy. That was, it claims to be the oldest Primitive Methodist church still in use in that part anyway of the country. Rosamedra makes a similar claim, but they're in a different circuit. The service at Wrexham was powerful and continued till 11 o'clock. And even then, the people were unwilling to leave. Several converted. So that was one of John Wright's comments. When I say journal, the ministers were required to keep a journal and write down what they'd done, where they'd been, what had happened, and submit it to the denominational authorities. And some of these journals, I don't know if any have actually survived, but there are long extracts from them that were printed in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. They make inspiring reading. Here's another extract from John Wright's journal regarding Wrexham, visiting the people from house to house at Wrexham. One woman born again. Thursday morning, March the 7th, had a prayer meeting at Wrexham. At night, preached at Lavister. It was a precious time. I gave the society their tickets and joined 7. The saving power of God came down. 5 souls were born again. Their evidences were clear and striking. 2 appeared to be sanctified wholly. The Lord blessed me also. I had been labouring under temptation for some time, but the Lord delivered me. You may find that if God's going to bless something that you're going to do, you may well be tempted by the devil before it, because he wants to get in and spoil it. Labouring under temptation, he comes to Wrexham and Lavister, preaches, and the power of God comes down. Later on, there were chapels built in Wrexham after John Wright's time. The first was in 1832 at the Beast Market. I haven't been able to locate an old photograph of the Beast Market showing the original Primitive Methodist chapel, regrettably. But J. Hutchinson sent this report to the denominational magazine. A gracious outpouring of the Spirit of God has been felt in Wrexham and its neighbourhood, and many sinners have been turned from darkness to light and from the power of Satan unto God. Not unto us, O Lord, but unto thy name be all the glories. Oh, the moving of God's Spirit in this area through these people that John Wright and other people with him were doing. Later, the Prims moved to Talbot Road. That was in 1879. That chapel is standing there. I only took that photograph about a few weeks ago. And it became the Church of Christ. I think it's abandoned now. It just looks like an abandoned building. No for sale sign outside, no notices, bits missing. But that's where they went in 1879. And then in 1911 they moved to Poyser Street, which has also been closed and in fact demolished, and that photograph comes from the local paper. But they got established here, and it was John Wright who started it. Now he left Burland. Another thing with Methodist ministers, not so much today, but they used to be moved around a lot. Every year or two they'd be stationed by the central authorities somewhere else. Went to Preston Brook next. He was imprisoned for preaching. Then he went to Shrewsbury. Then he went to Welshpool and Newtown. Not all in July 1821, but from then on. Mid Wales, the work of God broke out. The Lord filled me with faith and the Holy Ghost. 19th of January 1824, he wrote that. In these years, he went to Oakengates and preached as far away as Abergavenny. Then he remarried, another Martha, in fact. They were sent to Darlaston. And then in 1827 they were sent to Frome. Frome, it's not Frome, it's called Frome, it's spelled like that, and that's in Somerset. So moving around all the time, preaching the gospel. And then began really what turned out to be largely his life's work, where he got this nickname, the Apostle of Berkshire. In 1828 he was stationed as superintendent minister at Brinkworth. That's superintendent of the circuit, you see. Brinkworth is in Wiltshire. There you see the chapel. Again, it's closed, regrettably now. That was known as an especially violent, turbulent village. Travellers were afraid to go through it because they were very likely to be assaulted, mugged and robbed. And it takes a long time to get through it. It's called the longest village in England. I've driven through it. I thought, where on earth is this chapel? And you come to it eventually. It's a hugely long village. But a very violent place. And obviously to go there as a minister of the gospel in days of persecution was a great challenge. And a great work broke out. There's a whole book about the work in that area called Victory in the Villages by a minister called Tonks, T-O-N-K-S. In 1830 he sent Thomas Russell and Richard Jukes. Now that's Thomas Russell there to begin the Berkshire mission. Because, Brinkworth is in Wiltshire, over the border into Berkshire. That's how it started. He initiated it, sending these two men. There's Thomas Russell. He was then imprisoned in Abingdon, sentenced to hard labour, and I can't recall offhand how long that lasted, but it wasn't a good time for him, to put it very mildly indeed. And then we get to this point. If you know anything about Primitive Methodism, you've probably heard this saying, yonder country is ours, and you probably know about the prayer meeting that was held near Ashdown Park Corner. There you see Ashdown House. So it was from round about where this photograph was taken. We don't know exactly where, February 1830, and it kind of passed into the bloodstream of Primitive Methodism because book after book uses words from that event or quotes the story. So, called out to travel at 23, that's Russell, the man you've just seen, he was sent the following year to Brinkworth as the colleague of John Ryde. Soon after this, the Berkshire mission was opened, and for 5 months, not a single society was formed. I rather suspect that both the Baptists and the Methodists and others have gone for the last 5 months without forming a new church anywhere else in this area, and probably Berkshire too. Anyway, they went 5 months, not a single church was established. Appointed definitely to this mission, that's the Berkshire mission, in September 1829, Thomas Russell began the work that was to be attended with such hardship and suffering and to issue in such brilliant success. He was sometimes reduced to feeding on wild nuts and berries. They suffered. It was in the following February that he and his superintendent, that's John Ryde of course, he and his superintendent had the memorable meeting in the neighbourhood of Ashdown, where the famous battle was fought. Theirs, however, was a spiritual conflict. Russell walked 10 miles to this meeting for consultation and prayer. The conference was drawing to a close and they were about to part when it was proposed that they should turn aside into the coppice for another round of prayer. Entering the coppice, they threw themselves on their knees amid the snow and pleaded with God to give them Berkshire. The round of prayer lasted for hours, and at last Russell sprang to his feet, exclaiming as he pointed across the country, the prospect of which was bounded by the Hampshire hills, "Yonder country is ours. Yonder country is ours, and we will have it." Up to that time, everything had been dark, but now a brighter day dawned. One day, the young missionary was 18 hours on his feet and travelled 35 miles, preaching or trying to preach, for he met with the most brutal persecution in 3 villages, 4 times. But at the end of 3 years, there were nearly 1,300 members in that circuit. Wonderful work that was done. That was 3 years, but by that very September there were 250 members. And then John Ryde, moved from Brinkworth in Wiltshire to Berkshire itself. There were some further Berkshire chapels. Here's some that I've taken photographs of. Up on the left you've got Ebenezer Chapel at Aldworth, and then below it you've got Quick's Green, where the evangelist Isaac Septimus Nullis is buried, awaiting the resurrection, I might say. Then up on the right you've got Zion Chapel in Burnt Hill. That's the only one that's still in use. 1 service every 2 weeks. Sad, isn't it? And then here at the bottom on the right you've got Compton. But those are just some. I could have given you lots and lots of photographs, but just to show you the church planting work that went on. And there is Shefford, and the Shefford branch of the Brinkworth circuit became a circuit in itself. Now listen to this. By 1832 they had 60 preaching places. Just imagine if the Wrexham circuit had 60 preaching places. Wouldn't that be absolutely grand? By June there were 15 full-time preachers in the circuit and 1,284 members. That's just in the course of those 18 months or so. What a powerful work under the leadership of this man, John Ryde. That's what it's like in Berkshire today, and I don't suppose it's changed very much. In fact, one book about the area says that if a Roman legionary came back, if he'd been stationed there in the Roman times, he probably wouldn't notice very much difference. It really hasn't changed very much. They've managed to keep it beautiful and unspoiled. I went for a lovely long walk along there, by the way, and here you see another view of the area, but you see they used to hold their camp meetings up on the downs, which is why I wanted you to see that. It's the kind of place where they would gather, and sometimes thousands of people would come, and some would oppose and some would come to listen and some would be converted. So in April 1831 they began the Hampshire mission. That's from Shefford in Berkshire. Under Ryde's leadership, he starts sending people into Hampshire, down this area on the left. That's looking towards Lincolnholt, one of the first places they preached at, and Littledown, that's not my photograph, a local preacher sent me that one. One of the first chapels that was built in Hampshire is at Littledown, and sadly that's closed now as well. There's one of the earliest chapels that was opened, another one, that was 1838. John Ryde went there and evangelised along with other people, and this is St Marybourne in Hampshire in the Bourne Valley. So that's one of the very early chapels. It was demolished some years later, and another one was built about 20 years later, I think, and it's closed, but it still preaches the gospel, because over the door, as you walk along the village street, there facing you, if you care to look, are the words, "Prepare to meet thy God." The good old Prims, they put the word there, and it's still there for everybody to read as they walk along the road. And that was the Bourne Valley. The other place, or the second place they started as a centre, was Mitchell-Dever. Mitchell is Anglo-Saxon for great, and Dever is, interestingly, a corruption of the Welsh word Dúfr, meaning water, and so it means the great water or the great river, and that's what flowed from Mitchell-Dever during the course of that revival. There was a great river of blessing came from this place. They went there. It's New Winchester, 1832. Sometimes you'll see it spelt with a T. It used to be spelt with a T in the Victorian age, so quotations, it's not that I can't type, I'm not very good, but I do type, but the T in it is when it's in a quotation. Listen to this meeting. Edward Bishop was another Primitive Methodist minister in that area. This is the description of one of the camp meetings they held from Mitchell-Dever. The Down lies about midway between Winchester and Mitchell-Dever. On this extensive down we held a camp meeting on Sunday, May the 25th, 1834. Probably there were present at one time in the afternoon from 5,000 to 6,000 persons, and no fewer than 3,000 of them belonged to the ranks of our most violent persecutors. It was now that interruption and even danger were apprehended. A deep solemnity pervaded the hearts of our people. The Mitchell-Dever Society constituted one of the praying companies, and its members prayed until it seemed as if heaven and earth were brought together. I'd like to be in a prayer meeting like that. That's what it felt like. Heaven and earth came together there on the downs outside Mitchell-Dever. When we returned to the preaching stand, the vast concourse of people stood as if they were entranced. The preachers had extraordinary liberty, and the word was indeed with power. The people in prayer wrestled with God and prevailed, and the song of praise seemed to make the place a paradise. Somebody said to me, well, I've been asked to give a lecture at a church in Warwickshire under the title, "Why Study Church History?" And the reason is, one of the reasons is because we can look at that sort of thing and say, Lord, do it again. Lord, do it again. That's what I want to know what happened, not just out of an interest in the past, though it is interesting, but to be inspired to see what God and man working together can achieve. But prison followed again. That's Edward Bishop, the man who wrote the report that I've just read to you, or extracts from it. In the summer of 1834, John Ryde and Edward Bishop were imprisoned at Winchester after open-air preaching at Mitchell-Dever. They weren't held for long because there was no legal reason for holding them. They were told, we'll let you go quietly if you agree not to preach anymore. And they said, well, we can't agree, we're ministers, we've got every right to preach. And they said, well, you'll go to prison then. And they did. But it was brought to court, and after a time in prison, some weeks I think, the case was thrown out. And after that, of course, it was easier for the Methodists because the magistrates began to realise they couldn't persecute them under the pretense of law because it wouldn't work. It had been thrown out. There was a precedent. But they had to go through it. They were told they could go to the prison chapel services, which were presumably run by Church of England people, provided they didn't get too excited knowing that they were Methodists and disturb the meeting with their amens or whatever. But they said there was nothing there to get them excited anyway, regrettably. But there was continual opposition in Micheldever. Sir Thomas Baring, Bart stands for baronet. His opposition included blocking attempts to acquire land. The Prims agreed to purchase premises to erect a chapel, and he sent his agent and said to the person who was selling, I'll give you more money. And that happened the night before the Prims were going to take possession of it, and they just couldn't get land. And not until 1867, it's a long time. Remember, they started in 1832. It's constant opposition, not only from the mob, you see, but also from the powers that be, the squire, the magistrates. That's my wife, by the way, because this is another branch. We've seen them go to Bourne Valley, we've seen them go to the Micheldever area. Now Thomas Russell gets sent to the White Horse Vale. And there's my wife standing at it's the only picture I got of the White Horse Vale. My wife doesn't know she's on this. She'd tell me off if she knew. That's what it looks like. And Wantage, where King Alfred the Great stands there. That was one of the centres where they went. And again, terrible persecution. They were pelted with, in lots of places, but here including potatoes, eggs, flints. Sometimes they'd be drenched, sometimes they'd be dragged along the ground, knocked down, thrown into water. It was a terrible time. Not all, I'm saying, in Wantage area, but in that part of Britain, Berkshire, Hampshire and so on. April 1835, the Reading Mission began. Over 1,000 people attended the opening services. There were 4 ministers appointed. A chapel was rented. And by October, they had about 70 members. They gathered about 70 members. John Ryde didn't just sort of sit, on a kind of episcopal throne giving out directions. He went off doing the evangelism as well. And in 1837, he moved to Reading. Here is what it says in 1838. The chapel was well attended. The converting work rolled on and became so mighty that we were necessitated to hold many and at times long meetings. So this seems to be a man that the power of God just followed him where he went, whether it was Burland or Wrexham or Newtown or Wiltshire, Berkshire, Hampshire. And all of these missions had grown into separate circuits, that's to say a centre with several churches around them. By 1837, Micheldever, Farringdon, that's the White Horse Vale area, Andover, Reading and Wallingford, they'd all become circuits in their own right. Amazing. Then in 1844 he was stationed in London. You see there a picture I got off the internet of what London looked like round about that time, well, that's part of London. I like this. At first sight, this is what the Primitive Methodist magazine said. At first sight, his rustic garb, his heavy square jaw, his unpolished manners suggested that he was a most unlikely man to be of use in the London ministry. God bless him there as well. One of his co-workers was a woman called Mary Williams from Rhuaben. I imagine that that contact had been made whilst he was evangelising in the Wrexham area. The Methodist Society in Rhuaben used to be Primitive Methodist. And then in 1845, you see the way it grows. What did he start off doing? Talking to individual people and attending prayer meetings. That's the way to start. What's he doing now? He's appointed to visit missions nationwide, even the Channel Islands, even Northern Ireland. The denomination realised the value of this man. 1849 he was sent to Australia. People were being sent out there, of course. I suppose it was still the days of, what do they call it, when they were transported over there, sent there if they were criminals or whatever. Others no doubt went and settled. I don't know much about the history of Australia, but anyway, there were settlers there, and he was stationed at Port Phillip. Began to preach. There you see that picture, of course, is from today. I didn't go over there and take it just for your benefit. I got it off the internet. But the congregations and the membership began to increase there as well. He's getting quite old now, of course, getting quite old. But he's there 1851 to 1852, but during that period his health begins to decline, and he moved to Benalla, still open air preaching. Benalla had a chapel opened in 1861, but he died in January 1862, and there you see the plaque which there is for him at the chapel in Benalla. And you'll notice at the bottom it says, "Forever with the Lord." It's the same text that's on my grandfather's grave. He used to be a local preacher himself. Forever with the Lord. What a wonderful assurance to have after you have led a long life of service for Christ. Before his death, this is how he described himself: perfectly satisfied. I'm resting on the atonement. Tell all the friends to meet me above. What did he mean when he said I'm resting on the atonement? Well, go back to the day when he threw his hat in the air because he was so happy because God had forgiven his sins. Jesus had made atonement for him when he died at the cross, shed his blood, a perfect satisfaction for all his sins, and all that he might have done wrong, all his failings, his sins, any disobedience over the years. He knew it was covered in what Christ had done for him at the cross, and he could rest on that, resting on the atonement. Tell all the friends to meet me above. What about his children and widow? Well, he had 2 children with his first wife, Hannah and John. The second wife produced all of those which you see listed there. Martha died also in Benalla in 1873. And of course she shared her husband's faith as well as his life and ministry. She passed away peacefully and triumphantly. Thomas Russell, who you know was in prison for serving Christ when he was a colleague of John Ryde. This is what he wrote: John Ryde was no great preacher. His was the old story, but the Almighty made it mighty to the pulling down of strongholds. That's the kind of preacher that I would like to be. There we are. That's all I have to say on that. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to hand back to our minister now.